The Mullis family farm stretched across the quiet countryside of Oldville, Iowa. To any outsider, it might have seemed like a postcard-perfect image of rural life. Red barns lined against the horizon, tall stalks of corn swaying with the wind, the soft grunts of hogs echoing from pens. But behind the silence of the fields lay a marriage that was unraveling, thread by thread, until it would end in the most shocking and brutal way imaginable. Amy Lynn Mullis had grown up with a warm smile that drew people to her. Born in 1979, she was the kind of woman others described as radiant. Her laugh was infectious, her eyes full of kindness, and her gentle nature made her a dedicated nurse and a loving mother to 3 children. To the world, Amy was a devoted wife and farm mother, working tirelessly alongside her husband, Todd Mullis, a stern and disciplined hog farmer. But inside, Amy was suffocating. Friends would later describe her marriage as a cage. Todd was not just controlling, he was overbearing, demanding, and meticulous to the point of obsession. On the farm, everything had to be done his way at his pace on his terms. 4 years, Amy endured it quietly, pouring her love into her children and trying to preserve the picture of a perfect family. But the cracks had already begun to show. By 2013, Amy's unhappiness had grown too heavy to conceal. She drifted into an affair with another man, a choice born from desperation and longing for affection she no longer felt at home. When Todd discovered it, his rage was volcanic, though he didn't end the marriage. Divorce wasn't an option Todd would ever consider, not just for financial reasons but for pride. He needed control, and letting Amy leave would mean he had lost it. So life on the farm continued, but the atmosphere inside the Mullis home was icy, thick with unspoken tension. Amy's friends noticed her spirit fading. She had once been bubbly, social, eager to laugh and connect, but now she appeared cautious, reserved, as if walking on eggshells. Even her own children noticed her silences, the way she avoided conflict with Todd. Privately, Amy whispered her fears to those she trusted. She told friends she was scared to leave, worried Todd might retaliate. Once, in a chilling moment of honesty, she confessed to her son Tristan that if her father ever found out about her relationship with another man, he might kill her. Despite everything, Amy tried to carve small joys out of her life. But by 2018, her heart had wandered again. This time it was Jerry Frasher, a farmhand who worked for the Mullises. Jerry was married himself, yet he and Amy shared stolen moments, secret texts, and the kind of affection Amy felt starved of at home. She longed for escape, even telling her friends that she had been looking for a way out of the marriage. To them, Amy's despair was obvious, but they had no idea just how dire her situation had become. Meanwhile, Todd was growing suspicious once again. He monitored Amy closely, watched her movements, and scrolled through her phone. He confronted Jerry Frasher, forcing him to deny the affair even as Todd's paranoia grew sharper. Todd was a man who didn't like surprises, and now he was facing the possibility of losing the one thing he believed he owned completely, his wife. Just days before tragedy struck, Todd's search history painted a disturbing picture. On his computer were queries like, how to kill adulterous women, do DNA testing without mother's knowledge, what to do with large open wounds. These were not the frantic searches of a panicked husband. They were the calculated thoughts of someone preparing for an unthinkable act. By early November of 2018, Amy was growing weaker physically too. She had recently undergone minor surgery and was still recovering, her body fragile and vulnerable. Friends urged her to take care of herself, but Amy's responsibilities on the farm and the pressure from Todd left her with little room to rest. Every day seemed like a balancing act between survival and collapse. Then came November 10, 2018, the day that would forever shatter the Mullis family. It started like any other Saturday on the farm, but by sundown, Amy would be lying in a morgue, her body pierced by a pitchfork in a scene so brutal investigators would struggle to comprehend it. The story of that day is more than just a crime, it is a descent into betrayal, fear, and a chilling reminder of how the most ordinary places can hide the darkest secrets. The morning of November 10, 2018, began like any other on the Mullis farm. A chill hung in the air, frost clinging to the edges of corn stalks that were still waiting to be harvested. The hogs stirred restlessly in their pens, their grunts echoing against the silence of the countryside. For Amy, the day carried the same familiar rhythm she had followed for years: chores, family, the constant weight of expectation. Yet something about that morning felt heavy, almost suffocating, as though a storm was silently gathering around her. Todd had mapped out the day's work like he always did. He wanted Amy and their 13-year-old son Tristan to help with farm duties while their younger children played nearby. Todd was strict about chores, He prided himself on efficiency, order, and control. Amy, still recovering from her recent surgery, wasn't in any condition to handle strenuous tasks, but Todd insisted. To him, appearances mattered, and Amy's role as a hard-working farm wife was part of that image. Inside, Amy's body was tired, but her mind was even more restless. She had been confiding in friends that she wanted to leave Todd, though she was terrified of what might happen if she tried. The day before, she had sent a text to a friend saying she was afraid Todd would make her disappear if he ever found out the truth about her feelings for Jerry. That ominous thought lingered in her heart as she dressed for another day on the farm. By mid-morning, the family moved into the red barns, where tools lined the walls and shadows stretched across the floor. It was here, in this place of routine, where Amy's life would take its darkest turn. According to Todd, they had been working together when Amy suddenly complained of dizziness. She mentioned needing to rest and asked her husband to let her go inside the house. Todd, as he would later tell investigators, was worried but not alarmed. He claimed he allowed Amy to take a break, while he and Tristan continued with the chores. But Amy never made it back to the farmhouse. Minutes later, Tristan wandered into the barn to look for his mother. What he found would scar him for life. There, on the cold concrete floor, Amy lay face down. A corn rake, its sharp, four-pronged metal tines glinting in the dim light, was embedded deep into her back. The sight was grotesque, almost unreal, as if torn from a nightmare. Blood pooled beneath her body, spreading in uneven patches that soaked into the floor. She wasn't moving. She wasn't breathing. Panicked, Tristan screamed for his father. Todd rushed in, his face pale as he saw the horror before him. Together, father and son pulled the pitchfork from Amy's back and tried to lift her. Todd shouted at Tristan to help drag Amy's limp body toward the truck. They had to get her to the hospital, he insisted. There was no time to wait. Tristan, barely a teenager, was overwhelmed by the chaos. His hands shook as he tried to obey his father's orders. But deep down, something felt wrong. He remembered how controlled and calm his father seemed even in this moment. Almost too calm. And then there was Amy's body, the way the rake had pierced her so deeply. Could this really have been an accident, as his father would later claim? Todd drove at reckless speed toward the nearest hospital, his truck kicking up gravel as it sped down the country roads. Tristan sat beside him, his mind spinning, his heart racing. He glanced back at his mother, who lay motionless in the back seat. With every passing second, the truth began to dawn on him. His mother was gone. When they arrived at the emergency room, the scene turned chaotic. Medical staff rushed to the truck, pulling Amy's body onto a gurney. But it was too late. Despite desperate efforts, Amy Lynn Mullis was pronounced dead that afternoon. She was just 39 years old. News spread quickly across Oldville. A woman, beloved mother, nurse, neighbor, had died in what her husband claimed was a freak farm accident. Todd told doctors and police that Amy must have fallen on the corn rake while doing chores. To him, it was an unfortunate tragedy. But to the investigators who examined her body, it was a story that didn't add up. The wounds told a different tale. Amy hadn't been pierced once. The rake had entered her back not one, not two, but at least 6 times. Each puncture was deliberate, forceful, and impossible to dismiss as a simple accident. A chilling realization settled over the investigators. This wasn't bad luck. This was murder. And the prime suspect was the man who had driven her to the hospital. The days following Amy Mullis's death were a storm of grief, suspicion, and whispers that rippled through the quiet community of Oldville. Neighbors brought casseroles, church members sent prayers, and friends visited the Mullis farm, offering condolences to Todd and the children. On the surface, Todd played his role well, the devastated husband, the man who had just lost his wife in a tragic accident. He spoke softly, his eyes sometimes brimming with tears, but behind that mask of sorrow, many began to wonder what truly lurked in his heart. At Amy's funeral, her family sat in silent agony. Her parents could barely comprehend what had happened to their daughter. Her friends too couldn't shake off the unease gnawing at them. For weeks, Amy had been confiding that she felt unsafe in her marriage. She told them she was afraid of Todd, afraid he might harm her if she ever tried to leave. And now, here she was, buried beneath the cold November soil. Todd's behavior in those days raised questions. At times, he seemed too calm, almost calculated, as if the tragedy were another farm task he needed to manage. He gave interviews, repeated his version of events, and insisted it was an accident. According to him, Amy had probably been reaching for something on a high shelf in the barn, lost her balance, and fallen backward onto the corn rake. But investigators weren't convinced. They studied the rake itself, its sharp prongs, its placement in the barn. For someone to fall on it once was possible, though unlikely. But 6 separate puncture wounds? That defied all logic. The angle, the depth, the sheer brutality, it pointed to rage, not misfortune. Detectives began piecing together Amy's final months. What they found painted a portrait of a marriage crumbling under the weight of control, betrayal, and fear. Amy had been battling health issues, including recent surgery that left her fragile. Friends said she had grown increasingly unhappy, feeling trapped on the farm, where Todd kept a watchful eye on her every move. She had told some that she was planning to leave, even considering divorce. And then there was Jerry Frasher, the local farmhand with whom Amy had rekindled a secret romance. Text messages and phone records revealed a hidden world, one where Amy felt alive again, where she dared to dream of a different life. But those same messages also exposed her deepest fears. She wrote of Todd's temper, of his suspicious nature, of how she worried he would snap if he discovered her affair. One haunting message to a friend stood out: "If he ever finds out, I might not make it out alive." For investigators, the puzzle was starting to take shape. They now had motive, jealousy, and betrayal. They had opportunity. Todd was the only adult with Amy in the barn. And they had the weapon, the very tool Amy had been found impaled with. What they needed now was proof. Tristan, the 13-year-old son, became a critical witness. Detectives gently questioned him, asking about the morning his mother died. His account was haunting. He described how his mother looked weak and said she needed to rest. He explained how his father sent him into another barn for a heater. And when he returned, his mother was already lying on the ground, the rake buried in her back. But what struck detectives most was Tristan's impression of his father. He said Todd had been strangely calm, even controlled, in the moments after finding Amy. There was no panic, no desperation, only focus, as if Todd had already rehearsed what to do. Behind the scenes, investigators began to dig into Todd's past. They learned that his marriage had been rocky for years. He had a reputation for being domineering, quick-tempered, and deeply controlling. Some friends described Todd as the kind of man who needed everything in his life, and everyone in his family, to bend to his will. Slowly, a chilling picture emerged. Amy hadn't just been a victim of violence. She had been living under a shadow of fear for years, and November 10th was the day her worst nightmare finally came true. For the investigators, the question wasn't if Todd Mullis killed his wife. It was how to prove it in a courtroom, how to dismantle the mask of grief he wore so convincingly, and reveal the monster that lurked beneath. By the start of 2019, the investigation into Amy Mullis's death had reached a turning point. What began as a rural accident report had grown into a full-blown homicide case. Detectives had gathered enough inconsistencies, enough whispers from friends, and enough data from Amy's phone to see a darker truth unfolding. But if Todd Mullis was guilty, proving it would require tearing apart the carefully constructed story he told that November day. For months, Todd had repeated the same version of events. He said Amy was tired, recovering from surgery, and simply trying to help with chores in the barn. He claimed that he sent Tristan to fetch a heater, and in those few minutes, tragedy struck. His calmness, his insistence on the accident, became both his shield and his greatest vulnerability. Investigators began scrutinizing Todd's digital footprint. His phone records, computer history, and search activity painted a chilling picture of a man consumed by suspicion. Weeks before Amy's death, Todd had been searching for information about cheating spouses. He read forums about what men should do if their wives were unfaithful. He even scrolled through articles about how cheating partners often behaved before leaving a marriage. To prosecutors, this wasn't random curiosity, it was premeditation. At the same time, Amy's digital life told another story. Messages to her friends revealed that she was afraid of Todd. She worried about being followed, about being monitored. In her texts with Jerry Frasher, she expressed not only love but also desperation. She longed for freedom, yet she feared what Todd would do if he discovered the affair. The breakthrough came when investigators pieced together Amy's medical records. She had recently undergone a surgical procedure that made strenuous farm work nearly impossible. Yet Todd claimed she was helping him clean the barn, lifting heavy equipment, and performing tasks that contradicted her fragile state. It was another crack in his alibi, another sign that he was fabricating details to cover his tracks. Meanwhile, Tristan's testimony continued to haunt the investigation. Detectives noted how carefully he described his father's demeanor. When Tristan ran back into the barn and saw his mother on the ground, his father didn't scream or collapse in despair. Instead, Todd's first words were chillingly practical: "Go get the truck." That calmness unsettled everyone who heard it. Was it the reaction of a seasoned farmer who had seen injuries before, or was it the reflex of a man who already knew his wife was beyond saving, because he had been the one to kill her? By mid-2019, prosecutors decided they had enough. The motive was clear: jealousy, control, and betrayal. The weapon was obvious: the corn rake. The opportunity was undeniable. Todd was alone with Amy when it happened. And the cover-up, his attempt to disguise murder as an accident, was unraveling piece by piece. In September, authorities made their move. Todd Mullis was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. When the news broke, the community was stunned. Some defended Todd, saying he was a hard-working man devoted to his family. Others weren't surprised at all. They remembered Amy's whispered confessions, her nervous glances, her warnings that she might not survive if she stayed. Todd sat in the county jail, silent and cold. He pleaded not guilty. To the outside world, he maintained his innocence. But behind closed doors, prosecutors were preparing for a battle unlike any other. This wasn't just about forensics or testimony. It was about breaking through the mask Todd had worn so well, convincing 12 jurors that beneath the grieving husband facade was a calculating killer. The trial was set, and as the date drew near, tension gripped everyone who had known Amy. Her family wanted justice. Her friends wanted her warnings to be heard. And her children, torn between loyalty and truth, would face the most difficult test of all. In September 2019, the trial of Todd Mullis began in a packed Iowa courtroom. The small-town farming community, normally quiet and uneventful, suddenly found itself at the center of national attention. Reporters filled the benches, sketch artists prepared their pencils, and locals whispered nervously about the man they once saw as a hard-working farmer now standing accused of brutally murdering his wife. Todd entered the courtroom in a plain shirt and slacks, his expression cold and unreadable. He looked more like a weary farmhand than a calculating killer. His defense team leaned into this image. They described him as a devoted husband, a father who loved his children, and a man who was being unfairly painted as a monster. But beneath that image, prosecutors prepared to reveal a very different story. The opening statements set the tone. The prosecution argued that this was not an accident, not a random tragedy, but a deliberate act of violence. They told the jury that Todd Mullis had motive, his jealousy and rage over Amy's affair. They claimed he had means, the corn rake that pierced her body. And most importantly, they said he had opportunity, alone with Amy in the barn during those crucial minutes. Then came the evidence. Medical examiners testified that Amy's wounds could not have been caused by a fall. They explained the geometry of the injuries, showing diagrams of the puncture wounds. The rake had struck her at angles that defied the idea of her stumbling backward. To drive the point home, prosecutors brought the actual corn rake into the courtroom. The metallic tines gleamed under the fluorescent lights as jurors stared in uneasy silence. The digital trail was equally damning. Investigators presented Todd's search history. Phrases like cheating spouse signs and what to do if your wife is unfaithful appeared on his devices in the weeks leading up to Amy's death. The jury shifted uncomfortably as prosecutors suggested these were not idle curiosities but the thoughts of a man preparing for murder. Amy's closest friends took the stand, their voices trembling as they recalled her fear. They told the court how Amy worried Todd would kill her if he ever found out about the affair. Some of her words echoed like prophecy: "If something happens to me, it won't be an accident." Perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Jerry Frasher, the man at the center of Amy's secret life. Nervous and visibly uncomfortable, Jerry admitted to the affair. He confirmed that Amy had wanted to leave Todd, but that she was terrified of what might happen if she tried. His presence in the courtroom turned the quiet tragedy of a broken marriage into the explosive motive for murder. But the moment that gripped everyone came when Todd's own son, Tristan, took the stand. Barely a teenager, he walked nervously to the witness chair. His voice cracked as he described the events of that November morning. He told the jury how his father sent him out of the barn, how he returned minutes later to find his mother impaled on the corn rake, and how his father's calm, almost cold reaction struck him as strange. The defense tried to soften the blow. They suggested that Tristan, traumatized and grieving, might not remember things clearly. They argued that Todd's calmness was not guilt, but simply the behavior of a farmer used to dealing with emergencies. They painted Amy as unstable, a woman torn between responsibilities and her affair, implying that her tragic death might indeed have been nothing more than an accident. But as the days dragged on, the weight of evidence built like storm clouds. The prosecution hammered home each point. Amy's fear, Todd's jealousy, the impossibility of her injuries being accidental. Every detail chipped away at the image of Todd as a grieving husband. The jury sat in silence, absorbing every testimony, every piece of evidence. Behind them, Amy's family sat with eyes full of pain, desperate for justice. Across the aisle, Todd's children looked torn apart, caught between the memory of their mother and the presence of their father. By the time closing arguments approached, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. Everyone knew that once the jury left to deliberate, 12 strangers would decide whether Todd Mullis was a husband who suffered a tragic accident, or a calculating murderer who finally acted on his darkest impulses. The courtroom was silent when the jury filed back in. After hours of tense deliberation, 12 ordinary men and women carried the weight of a community's judgment. Every eye in the room was fixed on them. Todd Mullis sat motionless at the defense table, hands folded, his face an unreadable mask. Across the aisle, Amy's family clutched one another, bracing for what was to come. The four-person stood, holding the verdict slip with trembling hands. The judge's voice echoed. On the charge of first-degree murder, how do you find the defendant, Todd Michael Mullis? Pause. The room seemed to freeze in time. Then came the words that shattered Todd's carefully constructed life. Guilty. The gasp that followed filled the courtroom. Amy's family wept openly, years of fear and grief breaking loose in raw sobs. Todd's children sat stunned, torn between the father they still loved and the reality of what he had done to their mother. Todd himself remained eerily still, his lips tightening but his body unmoving, as if refusing to acknowledge the words that condemned him. The judge sentenced Todd to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel came down like a final nail in a coffin. The farmer who once lived a quiet rural life was now destined to die behind cold concrete walls. But the trial's end was not the end of the pain. In the weeks and months that followed, Amy's friends and family tried to make sense of a life cut short. They remembered her laughter, her kindness, and the way she carried the weight of her unhappy marriage in silence for so long. For them, the verdict was justice, but it could never bring Amy back. For Todd's children, the aftermath was even more devastating. They had lost their mother to a brutal murder, and now they had lost their father to a prison sentence. The farm where they grew up, once full of life and routine, stood as a haunting reminder of everything that had been destroyed. Todd continued to claim his innocence. In interviews and appeals, he insisted that Amy's death was an accident, that he had been wrongly convicted. But the jury's verdict stood firm, supported by the evidence, the testimony, and the shadow of motive that had followed him into the courtroom. The case left behind a chilling lesson. Behind the walls of even the most ordinary homes, darkness can fester unseen. Amy Mullis's death was not a random tragedy. It was the final violent chapter in a marriage poisoned by jealousy, secrecy, and control. Today, the barn where Amy took her last breath still stands on that quiet Iowa farm. Its walls carry a silence heavy with memory, a silence that whispers of betrayal, of fear, and of a woman who knew her life was in danger long before it was taken. The name Amy Mullis is now etched into true crime history, not just as a victim, but as a reminder of how easily love can curdle into obsession, and how behind the face of a husband and father can lurk the heart of a killer.